Hello, and thanks for the opportunity to join this forum. This presentation is about the work that Arthur Rylah Institute did on threatened plants and rainforests after the Black Summer bushfires. We're all aware of the enormous extent and severity of the 2019-2020 bushfires. There were hundreds of threatened plant species affected, and over 6,000 hectares of rainforest was burnt at high severity. ARI did field surveys in spring 2020. We searched for 75 threatened plant species that had had more than 50% of their known populations affected by the fires. We also did rainforest condition assessments for rainforests that had been burnt at high severity. There was a dramatic change in the vegetation structure with the loss of shrub layers and tree canopies, but there was also prolific regeneration at ground level. Most plants were growing back by resprouting, but there was also a lot of germination from seed. There was mass flowering of orchids, grass trees, lilies and herbaceous plants when we were there in springtime, so that was quite beautiful. So what did we find with the threatened plant species? About 2/3 of the 75 species that we searched for were regenerating successfully after the fires. But what about the ones we didn't find? We found very few of obligate cedar shrubs. These are the ones that don't resprout after fires and that need to grow back from seed. Some of the reasons we may not have found these are that they were too small or too few to identify where we were looking, or alternatively that some of the original site records were inaccurate. The other group that fared badly after the fires were the epiphytic orchids. These grow on rocks and woody plants and so are exposed to the heat of the fires. And so to the rainforests. These were of course significantly affected by the bushfires. In areas where they had been severely burnt, like in this picture here, the shrub and small tree and vine canopy was missing, though these species were growing back at the base by resprouting, such as this lily pilly in the photo. So the structure was very, very different. The damp and shady conditions created by this middle layer were missing, and in its place was a dense regeneration of early colonising plants like this incense plant. These next few slides are the other vegetation types that we surveyed and some of the threatened plant species that we saw. So this is a picture of Shrubby Dry Forest north of Orbost. You can see the canopies quite severely burnt, but there's a lot of eucalypt germination. And the plant there in the other photo is Goodenia Hesrafilla that we saw north of Buchan. Lowland forest, of course, very common north and south of the Princes Highway, had experienced a whole range of different fire severities. We saw these two threatened species amongst others, lilac lily and elegant daisy. Banksia Woodland is in this photo. The large saw Banksias were regenerating either by resprouting on the trunks or with new seedlings. Near Malakuta we saw the dwarf blue trumpet resprouting, which was good, seeing it's its only location. This is Riparian Shrubland along the Genoa River, which was burnt at very high fire severity. The two plants in the photos, shiny fanfern and Vetka bottlebrush, were threatened species that we found along other rocky rivers that had been burnt at high severity. Wet heathlands were very easy to spot with mass flowering of the grass trees and at some sites the crimson bottlebrush, so they were very beautiful. One of the threatened species we did see was the rush lily. And finally clay heathland, these heathlands near the coast. These photos are taken from near Malakuta. These were dominated by resprouting species, and the two threatened species we saw here were Heath Mobilia and Gippsland Banksia. So what are the key issues for threatened plant species that came out of the surveys and work that we did? First of all, what's happened to the obligate cedar species we didn't find? We really need to do some more searches to see whether they've genuinely disappeared from some sites or whether they were just not, we weren't able to see them at that time because they were too small or hard to identify. Also, how can we achieve fire-free periods that are long enough to allow these type of species to reach reproductive maturity? In other words, they need to grow for enough years to produce seed before the next fire comes along. And is off-site conservation needed for some endangered species at some sites where they may not persist? Organisations like the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Far East Victoria Landcare Group and the Australasian Native Orchid Society are involved in seed collection, propagation and future replanting. And finally, rainforests. The greatest long-term threat to the remaining stands of rainforest is the predicted increase in frequency and intensity of fire due to climate change. One of the effects of this is the drying out of the edges of rainforest, which allows the incursion of eucalypts into the edges as each successive fire comes, and the impact of that is to progressively reduce the size of rainforest patches. We really need to monitor the recovery over several years to see what this impact is. And finally, how can we protect rainforests from further fires? And what role do fire management plans play in this? I'd like to finish by acknowledging the many people involved in this project. Anne Tolsma and myself led the project. Judy Down and Jeff Sutter played a large role in the work that was done. We were very fortunate in getting a lot of information on orchids and threatened shrubs from Gary Backhouse and James Turner. We're very grateful for that because this was information on species and areas we would never have got to. And finally, the Royal Botanic Gardens has been doing similar work on other species and in other areas that will be brought together in a major report on this bushfire recovery work. So thanks again, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations.